Right. Checking everybody. Down.
Oh, wait. Oh.
No, we're not going to wait. Go on, down.
Sorry, Jackie. I was bored with that.
Okay. Okay, so life back to normal.
We just shook out for a minute.
Recovery.
Do you want me to make some comments about masks?
About what?
The masks. Do you want me to explain?
Yeah. Right, Jenny's got some instructions on the mask.
Morena Koto. Look, just a procedural matter around masks. Welcome, Tom. But because we have Tom in the room as a member of the public, not a part of our work bubble, to keep in line with the DIA guidance, we should all be wearing our face masks at the moment. And we have a box up here if anybody is missing one. Don't believe the guidance is specific on that.
Right. Welcome everybody to the full council meeting 28th October 2021. Item number 2, council blessing. Deputy Mayor Janet Holbrook.
Ia mātou e whiriwhiri ana i ngā take ki mua i o mātou aroaro. E pono ana mātou ka kaha tonu ki te whakapau mahara huapai mō na hapuri e mahi ne mātou. Me kahi hoki mātou katoa ki a whaihua ki a tōtika ta mātou mahi, a matamaia te tira whakamua me te hihiri ka taia te arahi i roto i te kotahitanga me te aroha.
Kia ora. Apologies, this Councillor Hanford for lateness. Anybody else? No? Just to say that Councillor Compton and Councillor Randall are online. Can we, somebody move to accept the apologies? Senator Holbrook, seconded. All those in favor say aye. Item number 4, declarations of interest relating to items on the agenda. I've had one indication, Councillor Compton for item 8.1.
Mr. Mayor, I also declare an interest in 8.1.
Okay, there's 2 of y'all. That's noted. Public speaking time for items relating to the agenda. We have Dr. Fred Davey on Zoom. He'll be speaking on item 8.1, the Gateway Review, and item 8.5, Representation Review. Welcome, Dr. Fred Davey. You have 3 minutes, and after that, there'll be question time. Before the 3 minutes, the buzzer will go. It will be useful for you to wind up. Thank you. You there, Dr. Fred Davey.
Dr. Davies, can you hear us? You just need to unmute yourself and share your video if you desire.
Okay, is that better?
Dr. Davey.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you fine. And
Dr. Davey, you've got 3 minutes for both your items. Before the 3 minutes, there'll be a buzzer. You may want to summarize, and then there'll be question time.
Fine. I hopefully will run through things fairly quickly. The comments I want to make about the representation review. This issue has been discussed extensively and the results of the survey summarised, so I won't comment further on that, apart from saying that I support the majority review of no change. However, associated with this, and also with the Kāpiti Gateway process review, I would like, with due respect, to suggest that councillors are provided with an independent research group to assess the details and appendices of these various reports. I think councillors are probably stretched to read in detail all the papers and reports that come across their desks. I know council staff provide summaries or comments or briefings for councillors, but several of these summaries which I have read do not give a balanced assessment of the issues. I think independent checks are needed. I think our councillors need backup independently. As part of this, and looking at democracy and consultation with the ART Confederation, is this consultation or is it direction? I note that TWAP, if I can use the abbreviation, directed council that half the community assessment panel for the Coastal Adaptation Project should be ART nominees. You can check that in the TWAP minutes, whereas they form 4% of the KCD population. A special status there? Yes, but I asked the question. And also, I would note that under the Three Waters project, 50% of the regional representative groups, and these are the people that control the water services entities, are from Mana Whenua. But where are the assets coming from? Mr. Maxwell, in his very nice commentaries on the Three Waters, did not comment on this aspect of the project at all. Since I noted this, you'll be aware that Minister Mahuta has decided 3 projects will go ahead. Kāpiti Gateway process review. I have a great respect for Martin Jenkins. I retained them myself 30 years ago. But again, look at the disclaimers in the report. I've not had time to look at the details of the report because I only managed to access it a day or so ago, but several comments look to be incorrect. Again, the report was for council officers and needs close analysis. What was asked for, perhaps informally, I don't know. It appears to reflect council officers' wishes. This allows me to move on to consultants' reports. I think 101 consultants is quite clear. Consultants give clients what they ask for. These are usually of 2 types. One, they're asking for what the client doesn't know, or else they're asking to justify what the client has already decided. So from that viewpoint, it is always important to see the disclaimers and the caveats that are attached to consultants' reports. And this brings me back why I think councillors could do with independent research backup. Finally, and this is a little bit off left field, I would agree, but I suggest you look at Waitangi Tribunal Claim WAI 2660. It will have submissions have been completed. It's now back to the tribunal to make a decision. It could have significant implications for coastal councils. That's all. Thank you very much for your time.
Just stay there. There might be questions. Open for questions. Councillor McCann.
Kia ora, thank you very much for your comments. I just wonder whether you think it is actually the role of councillors to read their papers and consider the items rather than read an independent or perhaps not even an independent summary of them. Do you not think it's our role to read and criticise them and or agree with them?
I would agree with you totally. My concern is, do you have time? Because my understanding, councillors are part-time people. There are a lot of papers coming around. There's a lot of issues around. If you have the time and to look into details of all the reports and especially read the appendices, because that's where the fishhooks are, if I might put it that way, then that's very good. Discount my suggestion of an independent support for you. I just think that council staff have their own priorities and their own understandings and interpretations, and looking at some of the documentation which has come out to you when you're discussing an issue, I, from my perspective, would think it is unbalanced.
Got one further question, Mr Mayor.
Yes.
Are you aware that councillors don't have our own budget? So effectively we would be asking council staff to employ that third party and we'd end up in the same situation that you are criticising?
Well, I'm not aware of your detailed financial situations. I mean, the concept was that I think councillors could well need, if you some independent of council staff commentary on papers which have been produced or reports which have been reduced or requested by council officers.
I thank you for your comments and for noting how long it does actually take out of our days to read all these papers, which is significant.
Dr. Davey, can you enlighten me whether you have looked at other councils and seen a similar, or what you're recommending to have been actioned anywhere else in the country?
I would have to say, Mayor Guru Nathan, that unfortunately I have not had the time to indulge myself in that. I'm looking at this purely as what I observe in terms of local government in the council situation which I am in. I haven't looked around any others. It would be useful to see what they do.
Thank you very much. Councillor Holbrook.
Yes, thank you very much for your comments, and agree that thank you for acknowledging the amount of reading that we have to do. We do try to read everything that comes across in front of us, and I think most of us do. So I'm just a little bit confused about what you're suggesting. We actually have 2 independent reports on today's agenda. So reading them, doesn't that cover your concern that we're not getting independent analysis of the information? So we've had all our submissions into the representation review, for instance, and we have an analysis of them by an independent party. I'm unsure about what you think is missing from that equation.
Well, I think in the case of the one which I presume you're referring to is the report by Evolve on the statistics of the responses. I think that is very valuable. I would cover it. But I would say with some of the reports you get, say, for example, a classic one would, for me, would be the PricewaterhouseCoopers one. For the gateways, if you look at the caveats through that document, which are all or mostly in the appendices, then I think it does need someone to do the analysis for you if you don't have time to read through all the appendices, because with that one, appendices were crucial. It was a lovely piece of work by PricewaterhouseCoopers, I would have to say.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Councillor Coots.
Look, appreciate you taking the time to engage with us this morning, and it's interesting to hear your thoughts and your responses. I'm just trying to understand whether you understand as councillors, as elected members, including community board members often, we have the opportunity to, I'll use the word interrogate, because in some instances it almost is, presenters on these independent reports. So as an example, we've got Mr. Gott here today from Martin Jenkins. Councillors already met with Mr. Gott in a briefing and asked a number of questions, including one from Councillor McCann, about was there anything he saw outside of the terms of reference that caused concern. So as a member of the public, are you aware that those additional meetings take place, that councillors are often in chambers numerous times a week with these briefings, with these external consultants, our auditors and so forth?
Well, I'm not aware of the detail of that. I am aware that you get briefings, particularly from council officers. But again, if you are getting an adequate amount of information and you will feel comfortable with it, that's fine. I just think I can see at times that there, for what we see as the general public, there does seem to be perhaps gaps or where assumptions have been made or things have not been looked at in detail.
Thank you.
Councillor Elliott.
Thank you very much, Dr. Davies, for your comments. I have to ask you a question, so I'm going to ask, can I please reassure you that we take this role very seriously and do spend a lot of time reading through these reports very thoroughly and are in fact quite engaged in all of the work streams, and this is just our role.
And that's good to hear. Thank you.
Councillor Pravanov.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Dr. Davey, for coming along today and raising this issue. So, as you've heard from my fellow councillors about how seriously we take this role and the amount of work that we do have to get through, and we have a number of independent reports that come to us, and some are actually less technical than others. But I'd be interested to know what your view is on whether reading a technical report is good enough as opposed to understanding it, and whether or not we have this, as elected members, we have the skills to actually understand some of those reports, and council staff can actually answer those questions as well, because they are the ones who have actually commissioned the independent report, probably because they don't necessarily have the skills in-house as well.
Well, I won't underestimate at all the effort you put in and the time you put in. If you feel that you are getting adequate information and understanding and getting a clear picture of what the situation is which the reports relate to, then my suggestion of an independent support group would be unnecessary. My concern would be, bearing in mind that you are not full-time people, is that you are overworked and you need a little bit of support, particularly for sorting out some of the technical sides. Now, if you feel you are getting that from these meetings, which I'm not privy to, so I don't know what they're like, then fine, if you're happy. But I'm just quite conscious of the fact that I think if you feel you need it, you should be given additional support.
Thank you.
Councillor Holliday.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Dr. Davies, Martin, Councillor Holliday here. Look, I just wanted to tease out your thoughts around, you just mentioned there even an independent support group. Are you talking sort of like a community-based group or a community representative, say, for want of a better way of putting it, that perhaps like you mentioned an independent support group with regards to perhaps people that are in the community that, I don't know, have specific skills in certain areas that could look at information that's coming through and perhaps do a counterbalance to council officers? Is that the sort of thing you're talking about, or are you talking about sort of something more official, like the Martin Jovey company or something along that sort of line?
Initial thoughts was basically along just a person or group of people who could support you, who have technical ability and the time to actually look into some of the issues you're dealing with. Further than that, I haven't taken it because basically I thought, well, let's float the idea because I do gain the impression that you have this tremendous amount of paperwork to go through. You do not all have the appropriate expertise, and I can see that come up. For example, when I sat in on one of your budget discussions a year or so ago, I was a little bit concerned there because I could see council staff were leading you rather than the other way round. So, no, I've not got any more firm thoughts than that. I'm happy to develop them if one wishes me to, but I would need to know a lot more about some of the details of your interactions with other support people. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that.
Councillor Compton.
Kia ora. Thank you for that, Fred. I just want to pick up on that discussion point around independent advice for councillors. And are you aware that with the Auckland amalgamation in 2009, they set aside, I think, 0.2% of the council's annual budget for a given year goes to the mayoral office, which is all part of providing, I guess, the mayor's office up there with the capacity to lead engagement and do so somewhat independently of existing council structures. And also, are you sort of envisaging, I guess, a local government version of what came out of the Hun Lang report in 1989, which was commissioned by incoming Prime Minister Sir Geoffrey Palmer, around having those separate political advisors and having that separation between the political and administrative functions, and so you've got a contestability of advice, and that's something that sort of has arguably been a unique development within the New Zealand parliamentary and executive framework that's, I guess, provided that it's diluted the power of public servants over the control over the advice they provide as ministers.
Right. Well, I'd have to say, for a start, you are well ahead of me in terms of knowledge of detail on something like that. I'm very much a simplistic person and looking at what I see are the immediate problems. If, from what you say, what happened up in Auckland is interesting, I think you have the advantage now of seeing what happened there, and with the knowledge you have of that, you can start seeing then how we should evolve, perhaps, if we want to take on some similar thing down here. I've not gone that far. I'm not an expert by any means on local politics.
No, thank you. I was just curious because I think your idea or what you're suggesting sort of picks up on those things. So that's something I'm looking at exploring over the next few months anyway, with obviously all the local government reform that's going on. So I thought your point was a really interesting one. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you for the comments. That's educated me as well.
Dr. Davey, there doesn't seem to be any more questions. You can stay around and listen to the two items that you've raised on the representation review and also the review on the Gateway project. Can I just add that what the issues that you're broaching is actually a subject to be considered under the local government sector reform that's already starting.
Right.
I take your point that elected members, given the remuneration that we have and the expertise that we carry, on one side, if you look like if I can make an analogy to a rugby match, the governance side of the scrum is not as empowered as the management side right across the board. So, but that's an issue for the local government reform. I think in the meantime, it is what it is. And I always stress the point that elected members put your hands up for the job. You then cannot say, I'm underpaid, I haven't got time. You can't say all those things because you went in knowingly into a role, a public role that you've volunteered yourself for and the people have elected you. So on that note, thank you for your erudite submission and the discussions that you've initiated. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Right. Item number 6, public speaking time responses. I think the two items we'll consider. Yes.
Mr. Mayor, you raised a really good issue that we go in supposedly knowing what's in the role, and I know that I have raised in the past that some of the information provided for potential councillors and potential community board members doesn't adequately let those potential people know the time frame and the time that's required.
You mean the induction process?
Yeah. Oh, no, before the induction process, the information provided to
the pre-induction process.
Yeah,
for candidates.
I just want to challenge you that I don't think people do go into this role knowing the actual hours that are required at either a community board level or at a council level, and that's something that's been raised before you.
Yes, and there is also the factor that we have returning candidates, returning elected members. So there should be some maturity. Although this council district is famous for at least 1/3 turnover. Right, having said that, item 6B, leave of absence. Any leave of absence? No. We have item 6, matters of an urgent nature. Councillor James Coates has raised an issue which I will signal that I will second. The document, Tanika, you. I'll give them a few minutes to go through it. I think they've got it online. Yeah. Councillor Compton and Councillor Randall, you there?
Thanks. Oh, yeah.
Yep. I think a copy will be sent to you all via email. Will be, yeah. So I'll just give you all a few minutes to go through this. Yep.
Councillors Compton and Randall, I should have sent an email, has been received now.
Councillor Coates.
Thank you, Worship. Colleagues, I'm sure that you will all be aware by now of the announcement from the Honourable Minister Nanaia Mahuta yesterday regarding the Three Waters reform. Up until now, our council has kept a fairly neutral stance in working with the process defined by the Minister and providing feedback in terms of what this means to Kāpiti residents. The announcement yesterday around removing that right to opt in or opt out was disappointing, and I think it's important for us to show some leadership for our community today in response to that, to raise concerns around the backtracking from the Minister in terms of the opt-in, opt-out option, specifically in light of our standing orders, which provides the community an opportunity to have a say on the matter. You will note that the nature of the wording is one of still willing to talk. We are. It is not to attack the Minister, noting that our council has continually said that we support some form of reform, and simply inviting the Minister along with our local MPs to come and engage with us around what we think is a proposal that's fit for our community. So I would ask that you support this publicly, and I hand it over to His Worship the Mayor, who I hope can facilitate this through the Mayor's office and extending that invite to the Minister and our two local MPs.
Right. Questions? Councillor Elliott.
Look, thank you very much, Councillor Coates, for bringing this to the table today, and it is something that I think most of us walked in today and asked the Mayor if we would have time and the opportunity to discuss Three Waters. It is a very disappointing announcement, and I agree with everything that's been written here, totally support it, and I just ask you to clarify what it is that you envisaged as far as the meeting. Would it be here? Would it be in Wellington? At the MP's office? Would it be public, non-public, and who actually is council? Are you referring to management, elected members, public representatives.
Good question.
Can I just respond? Normally, it's a request made to the minister's office. The minister will then decide, and it's her call in this matter. And I know from previously that the meeting will take place, if it happens, in her office. Once the invitation is made and she's accepted it, we will then have to decide the delegation. The mayor will obviously be one. I will obviously expect the mover of this motion to be also one of them, the deputy mayor. That's my expectation at the moment. You've got anything else to add?
Look, if I could just add my experience in the past, and if I maybe just refer to the decision around fibre, where we sent a delegation and was simply that, and actually as one of the members and when I say this, I don't have beef about it, I was excluded, but I understood the fact that there is an appropriateness that plays out in terms of having the opportunity to meet with the minister, and I think in that instance it was His Worship the Mayor, Councillor Gaylor, and a staff member that met with the minister at the time. And so it is a delicate game of politics in terms of not sending a dozen people down there to meet with one person. I think it's having the right people in the room, and the main thing is actually having the opportunity to be heard on behalf of our community. So whatever it takes to get that meeting, I think we need to do it.
Thank you. Now I guess the public or anyone watching will have a clearer idea of expectations. So thank you.
Councillor Holbrook.
Yes, I want to thank Councillor Coutts for bringing this to the table today too. I think it is urgent, and I think across the sector there's a lot of disappointment, to say the least, about the decision yesterday. So I just wanted to kind of look back a little bit about that section in our standing orders, 9.16. I was chair of the community board at the time that we introduced water meters, and one of the huge concerns was the danger of privatisation of our water assets. And that provision was put in place primarily to protect our community and ensure that we retained community ownership of our assets. And that's exactly what we're losing now. But that might not be the end of it. There is no safeguard against future privatisation of all of the country's water assets in the future as yet that I have heard. So I think it's the focus of this motion today is really appropriate, and I thank Councillor Coutts for bringing it to the table.
Right, anybody else?
I just want to
Councillor McCann.
just add my voice of support to Councillor Coutts. I think it's really important that we try and continue the dialogue, and I think that's one of the most important things, is try to continue the dialogue, otherwise you get caught out. And I'd only urge the council to send a small delegation. Large groups of people are not conducive to healthy discussions in that instance.
Right. Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Through the Mayor, I just had a suggestion because it refers to 2 local MPs, but technically our district has 2 other MPs who cover the area, those being Adrian Rurofi and Debbie Nareda Peka, who both cover the Māori electorate that covers Kāpiti as well. So I think it would be appropriate to you obviously want to include Adrian because he's part of the Labour Party, and obviously I think Te Pāti Māori has an interest in this as well, being one of the strongest voices for mana whenua in Parliament. So I think it would be appropriate to include them, given that they're also responsible for the area that we cover.
James.
Thank you, Gwyn. If you're happy, we can take that offline. My key goal is to secure a meeting, and as I'd said to Guru offline, if we tried to include too many people, trying to get that date and that opportunity might become impossible. and it could be a reason for the Minister to not be able to meet with us due to the unavailability. But I'm happy to take that offline if everyone else is okay with that. I think the main thrust of it is to be able to get an audience. One thing that I failed to mention at the start, Your Worship, as well, is one of the other reasons for putting this matter to the table is to send a signal to our community that we're not sitting back, that this is important, that we oppose the mandated approach or the removal of the opt-in out. And so it is not only sending a signal to the Minister and requesting her to meet with us, but also sending a signal to our community that we're onto this and we are trying to get the best outcome for this community moving forward.
Right. No other questions been raised. I have a matter of an urgent nature moved by Councillor Coates, seconded by the Mayor. Do you want to write a reply at the moment? No. Open for debate? No. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against? Councillor Compton and Randall, you okay? Right. It's carried. Thank you very much. You have the item number 7, Mayor's report. Can somebody move? Can I have a mover? Councillor Angela Buswell and Councillor Holborough seconded. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Carried. We now go to item 8, reports. Natasha. Item 8.1, findings from the independent process review of the Kāpiti Gateway Centre Project.
Thank you, Your Worship. Good morning, Councillors, Mr Mayor. I will do a short introduction and then I will hand over to Mr Tom Gott, who is here, who's the reviewer that was commissioned to do this work for us. The report itself I will take as read, but just providing some initial background. It's worth me just reminding a little bit about the context. At the time that this review was commissioned, it was initiated based because of concerns that were expressed clearly by councillors and by some in the community in the lead up to the 25th of February council meeting, when the council made a decision to fund the project. It was confirmed then that a process review would be undertaken, but that the project progress was not contingent on the findings of this review. The focus of the review was to look at what could be learnt and apply that to future projects. Such a review is a really useful process to identify how we can improve over time. The process itself, we have, in terms of the findings, there are some changes that we have also made to the project in the light of that, and those are detailed in the report. So the terms of reference we've set on the 30th of March, the process was to include interviews internally and externally and a review of the range of council documentation. In terms of the scope of the review, the terms of reference detailed that it should cover an examination of the project processes that were include, but not limited to, how key decisions were made and how they were communicated, the appropriateness of project phasing and timeframes, whether we followed our guidance for good practice in terms of what was communicated and when, and the impact of external circumstances such as the COVID-19 pandemic on the project, which included changing things like central government funding as a result of COVID, and how all of that may have affected council processes or the engagement. So Martin Jenkins were commissioned to undertake this review for us as an independent party. Tom Gott was the lead reviewer, and I will hand over to him now to run through his report and findings. And at the end of Tom's presentation, either Tom or I, both Tom and I, will be happy to take any questions.
Right. Welcome, Tom.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Tom Gott toku ingoa, kia ora tātou Mayor, Councillors and attendees. I'm going to step through a brief presentation which summarises key points of the review and then I'm assuming there'll be time for questions afterwards. So if we go to the scope and approach, and Natasha has already talked about this, so that's the next, oh, it's me. Apologies. As you can see there were 4 things that we needed to cover. Natasha has talked about those. Out of scope were individual competencies and also, importantly, concepts and design of the Te Uruhi Gateway project. So we were looking at a process review, not a review of the concepts and design. And we got information from looking at documents, interviews, and then we carried out our assessment and reporting. So that was the review approach. Useful, I think, to just reflect on the timeline. This is a project which has been bubbling away for 29 years, at least, in the community. And I think that is a significant reflection because things have happened over that time at different times. If we go to that timeline, now you can't see that in detail, but it's actually in the report. But what you can see on that slide is there's a slice in the middle with the red and the orange bars. Those are the times from the 25th of March 2020 to the 13th of May 2020, level 4 and level 3 lockdown. And those had an impact on aspects of the process quite significant. They're not the only things that we looked at, but it's useful just to be reminded that in 2020 there was a lot of activity happening on the project. If you have a look at the other thing in the diagram is on the left-hand side from 1992 through to 2019, there was some activity, but not a huge amount. 2020, the booster rockets came on, largely driven by the opportunity to put in an application for the PGF funding. And that application was put in or started work on in early 2020, and there was a end of May deadline for putting that in. So not even a year to do that, but half a year or even less than half a year. So that happened over that COVID period. The timeline looks at project milestones. If we go now vertically down, things that happened in governance and management, stakeholder engagement, elected member engagement, and communications. And I think a reflection would be there was some extensive wide community engagement in the early period, particularly around the 2018-2023 long-term plan and the McLean Park development plan. When we come to 2020, there was engagement, but it was more localised. And I think that's an important distinction, that the wider engagement wasn't happening as much as it had happened earlier on. Also in that period, 2020, there were groups set up to actually contribute towards the process. They had a very limited time frame in which to make their contribution. And so the project needed to, and this comes through in the issues and recommendations, to really think hard about how we can give the time and the space for those groups to do their job. And there were some real constraints on the resources and activity to enable that. Partly due to COVID, also partly due to the fact that the council is a very busy place. People are busy anyway, and so some things can get lost in the mix. And that's a lesson learnt there. So I'll move on to some of the findings. First of all, before we get into saying what are the lessons learned, it's useful to reflect on achievements from the project. The gifting of the name Te Uruhi as part of the process was and the support from the iwi partners, particularly in that period of 2020-2021. Gaining of the Provincial Growth Fund funding, 2.23 million, over the COVID period. That was a significant achievement. Project feasibility results. The timeline, there were a number of project feasibility studies, so there was quite a bit of information coming through on different aspects of the project, but that, I think, meant that there was quite a bit to think about, to mull over. Challenge was the communication of that as part of the process. There was strong engagement, as I've said, in the early stages of the Maclean Park Management Plan, and the New Zealand Recreation Association, as it was then called in 2018, actually recognised that. And the Gateway project, as it was called then, was part of that Maclean Park Management Plan in a small kind of a way. And finally, Council approval for funding in February 2021 to proceed with the project and to front up with the additional 2.23 million. So those are achievements from the project. Moving now into issues and challenges. The extended timeline and the association evolution of the project concepts over that time period had an impact for engagement and levels of community interest and understanding. So, and the report does actually spell out how that evolution actually took place.
I want to change the...
Oh, sorry. I'm not very good at multitasking, clearly. Apologies for that. And I was never very good at it, so I'm not going to say that's a sign of age. So, the evolution of the project concepts over time. The project started off from a gateway facility to Kāpiti Island to ending up being a gateway to the region. And it sort of, there were nuances and changes in that concept over that period of time from 2017 right through to 2021. And the level of interest, therefore, in the project moved from quite local to a wider community interest. And that was something that I don't think the engagement processes picked up on in the project. The COVID response requirements did have a material effect for staff and leadership contributions and the capacity for direct engagement with stakeholders. We all know that, and now we're experts at it, of course, we're power users of Zoom and Teams and remote communication, but some of us were just learning or hadn't even learnt anything at that stage. And so that had an impact for the kinds of communication that were happening and the quality of communication. But it also meant that the last point there, the KCDC leadership involvement in the project could have been stronger. People were pulled off into emergency response, and there was kind of like a revolving chair almost situation with different people coming in from different parts of council to support the governance group. And so there wasn't that strong feedback loop between governance and leadership to governance. Was one of the things that we picked up. So that when there were some issues with the project, they weren't really seen to be as big as they might have been, or they weren't addressed necessarily in the correct way, in the appropriate way. And the decision to apply for PGF funding in early 2020 increased the pressure on the staff and the process to deliver. And I've talked about that short window of time there. Engagement structures to support the project development were not fully leveraged. How's that for a bullet of management consultancy speak? What that is saying is that there were some groups that were formed to play roles. There was a governance group, there was an advisory group, a councillor working group later in the piece, and these were all pulled together fairly quickly, and there wasn't really clarity to people on those groups as to what their role was, or even clarity to those people who were interacting with those groups as to how they might interact. And also, because of the time pressures, some of those groups weren't given time to actually think about things. The advisory group, you'd think if you're an advisory group you were being asked for advice, but in actual fact the impression we got was that the advisory group was given briefings more often than not, and only met a couple of times. So there were challenges there with engagement. And that communication engagement was one of the stimuli for councillors requesting to set up a council working group. So there needed to be more thought given to how, when you do form groups, how you actually work those groups and clarity of roles. So communications was another area. On project progress and process were planned, but there were challenges with the execution of plans. So there was a detailed comms plan in March 2020, which had key messages, stakeholders, approaches, all that sort of thing. But it never really got into the project plan. The project planning was very focused on, look, we've got a job to do here. We have to get that money. And so therefore, it was quite rigorous project planning. We'll go through these steps and we'll get there. But the communication side of things wasn't really on the agenda. There was also challenges with provision of communications resource to the project, because communications resource was out there responding to COVID demands. And so there were challenges there on that resource. The rationale, as a result, behind decisions and process wasn't explained adequately, and people filled the gaps with their own perceptions and narrative. So when certain things had happened that people within the project knew, certain information had come from feasibility studies, certain information had come from other areas, or certain decisions were made, they weren't really made transparent. There were press releases on the website, but those weren't getting into some of the rationale behind why we're doing things this way or where we're going. And so people in the community filled the gaps with their own perceptions and their own narrative. And that in itself then, when those weren't addressed, or when they were addressed too late, caused friction in the project. There needed, therefore, if we go into lessons learned, multitask, Tom.
Lessons learned.
Lessons learned, yes. There needed to be additional attention to communication engagement to bring the community along with the changes across the lengthy timeline, and multiple touch points for concept development and design. So it was a project that did actually need quite strong communication and engagement resource and management of that. It needed to recognise the significance of and the level of community interest in the project itself, and the types of resourcing needed to communicate and engage early on to accommodate this. So that was to complement the work of the governance group and the project team. More time was needed to be given to project review activity and reporting, taking stock of adjusting resourcing and communications accordingly as pressures from PGF funding application process and the COVID-19 response mounted. What that is saying is the project got into let's move forward mode, keeping moving forward, but there's no kind of let's step back and reflect, hey, where there's an issue here, or let's just have a bit of a gateway. How are we doing? Have we covered off things? Are there risks that we haven't addressed or that we should be addressing? There was no kind of feedback loop in the project planning. And that's a key part of effective project management. So that's another lesson learned there, that to step back and take a breath, take stock and then adjust accordingly, rather than just marching on to achieve the objective. You achieve the objective, but then there's a bit of collateral damage along the way. A more timely flow of information into the community was needed at the various points of change within the project across the timeline and on platforms that the community used to engage with each other. So what that is saying is that there was, and you'll see if you go back to the timeline, communication on the council website and on the council Facebook page, but largely on the council website, press releases and so on. But I think there needed to be going to the community with communications rather than waiting for the community to come to you. So you put something up and then, oh, well, we've done it, so someone will come and look at that and we've done the communication. More thought around how are people communicating, what platforms are they using, and how could and should we be engaging with that. And that means resource needed to be applied to that, but that's important to then include that resource. There were, as we've said before, people were making assumptions and they were coming to their own conclusions and perceptions and creating their own narrative and stories, and some of that was misinformation, either intentional or unintentional, but it doesn't really matter. But that created some challenges. And there needed to be a steady beat from the council of factual information across media to counter that. So that's not saying that there needed to be arguments or polemic, but there just needed to be, look, this is what's happened, this is the rationale for this, and you can make up your own mind as to what the situation actually is. So 2 points in the next is this notion of project efficiency and project effectiveness. So you can be really efficient in terms of project management and so on, and you need to be, particularly when there are time pressures, but you also need to be thinking about the effectiveness of the project, the outcome you're trying to achieve. And that needs to be addressed through adequate support for comms and engagement and the rationale for these to get that community understanding and connection. So while the KCDC website is a key council medium for communication, the community doesn't necessarily use the website as a vehicle for comms, or the assumption shouldn't be made that it would. And there are social media platforms that are used, such as community Facebook pages for connecting and communication. And that's what we picked up, that there was quite a bit of communication going on those fora. And so we know the council does use some social media, and there were some challenges with comms resource at the time. But there's a lesson here around the council thinking about how it might engage on those community pages. They don't necessarily mean getting in their boots and all, but maybe just providing some links to its own story back on its Facebook page or links to the website. Just getting that factual information out there could have assisted. So those are the highlight lessons, if you like, from the review. There's some more detail in the report around those, but I think the key message coming through is ensuring that there was a good connection between the leadership of the council and the governance group and what was happening in the project, ensuring that there was good communication and engagement and understandings developed, and ensuring that those groups that were formed to play their role in the project actually had the time and the space and the support to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tom Gott. Question time, Councillor McCann.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's a very thorough report, and thank you for spending your time coming to visit us and talk to it. I've got a number of questions with leave of the Mayor to work through. One of the things that, and there's a small preamble that we noted to councillors, was that as the working group of councillors, we were concerned about this project and we wanted some form of review, and I spoke to the CE who advised me that it's normal process, and when something like this occurs there's going to be a review, and that was communicated to councillors and there was no objection. But it does bring to the question, who is the client for this report?
Well, the client, as I saw it for this report, was the management of KCDC. This was a process review, so as far as I could see, good management practice is you do something, you have some challenges, so you say, let's go back and have a look at what the process was. And I know there were different interests in the whole review, in the project and the review, but that was what could the council from a process perspective, learn from an independent review of its processes.
So noting that the client is effectively the staff side of what people perceive of council, were you asked by the client to remove anything from the report?
Yes, and I'll just refer back to Dr. Davies' comment around the disclaimer. The disclaimer in the report doesn't say, read this report and then disregard everything we've said. The disclaimer says, this is a report that's based on information provided to us, best endeavours, and through the process of drafting, you develop more insights and information. So we did get information from the council that either increased our understanding of things or actually added to them. But there was nothing removed from the report as a result of a request from council.
Thank you. The next question I have is, in hearing that information, was there anything in the process of hearing that information, and I know that you heard from people who were supportive of the project, people who opposed it, was there anything that invalidated the decisions that councillors or staff made?
Not that I would say, no. There were things we heard which challenged the process, but not invalidated decisions.
One of the things that we heard in the public arena and around this table during public session, I think, was that the Auditor General was interested in looking at this report. Was there anything in scope of this report that you consider would give pause to an office such as the Auditor General?
No, not in my view.
And was there anything out of scope, because you've talked about that there were some things that were talked to you that were out of scope. Was there anything out of scope from those people who thought they had information about the irregularities involved that would give an office like the Auditor General pause?
No.
Pause for concern?
No, I mean, I wouldn't have thought so.
Thank you. I think that's very clear. My next question is around communications, and it does come with a proviso that we need to look back. You've written a previous report that was an independent report commissioned by councillors led by Councillor Coots. What are some of have you reflected on some of the lessons that you outlined in that report regarding communications, which potentially the same mistakes occurred in this project?
Yes, I have. I didn't include a connection in this report because I felt it was something that needed to stand alone. But if you go back and look at the previous report, there were similar issues that were raised back then in 2019. And the difference between 2019 and 2021 was that COVID happened. So while it was always going to be a challenge because of the stretch on council to address the recommendations of the independent report, my understanding was the council was going to address those, or was addressing some of those, and then suddenly you have a different scenario, and that put extra pressure on. But you know,
and your report looks at the increased pressure on staff and councillors and the community at that time. But in your experience, when there's a vacuum of information, what is that filled by?
It's filled by other people's stories.
And it's quite clear in your report that you are suggesting that there was a vacuum of information. And I'd like to ask you, whose responsibility for that vacuum of information? Who's ultimately responsible for making the call on whether we engage with the community or not?
That would be a leadership responsibility, and that was one of the issues that if the council leadership had the opportunity to be more engaged or was more engaged, that would have been picked up, or should have been picked up and addressed, councillor.
And one of the good learnings, I think, from your report is that we've got project management teams and a different way of operating, which I think, looking around the room and the reports back we've had, that is very, very positive. Is there anything you've heard about the new way of working that that might lead to another one of these mistakes, or do you think the embedded nature of comms and the leadership connections that the new project management teams have created will fix the issues or not?
I think that, and it's great that there are those initiatives that are being taken, that there should still be some thought given to the fact that, it's not just putting in transactional activities to sort issues. We need to be constantly thinking about the effect and the risks. And as long as that side of the equation is addressed, then you'll have an improved situation.
And note, I've really got a question for staff around that, because in the response to the report, there's an acknowledgement that we don't have the resources to put on Facebook. And you've acknowledged that we are placing information on our website and regarding that as a source of truth, but that's not necessarily filtering down to where people are actually visiting. In your opinion, do we need to have a council and staff discussion about how we bridge that gap?
Yes.
Thank you. And final question, is there anything that you believe councillors could have done to change the trajectory that occurred within the community?
Councillors themselves were concerned about messages they were hearing. It's very hard once something's sort of got momentum to change that. Councillors were, as my understanding, communicating when they could. At other times they weren't able to because they either didn't have the information or they were involved late in the piece. And so that's one of the challenges. I mean, the councillors have a governance role. They don't have the management role. And so therefore you have that sort of challenge in your governance role. You're relying on that other side of the equation to give you the support. So I wouldn't necessarily say that there was anything the councillors were or weren't doing. I think it's more than just a councillor response here.
So, Mr. Mayor, that's the end of my questions. I just note that I think as a team we need to have another discussion about the role of communications, the fact that we've got a report here from Tom in the past that specifically outlines those gaps within our council communications, and a second report that again outlines the same thing. We need to have a further conversation about how we can fill those gaps and find a way forward.
Thank you. Can I ask the following question? Tom, you talked about the vacuum of information, and when you have such vacuums, other people fill that with what they consider to be their own information. I take it from that you're talking about the public. In your review, did you come across the vacuum of information being also amongst elected members who have then gone on to contribute to the disinformation or misinformation?
Specifically, I don't think I could actually identify individuals who were necessarily on, contributing towards that, Mayor. I mean, the lesson here is that understanding that there was a gap and there was a vacuum, and that therefore people will make assumptions, and it may well be that there was something said by someone or on either side of the fence. But very hard, and again, we're hearing people give us their opinions and their views. So I'd hesitate to say specifically one way or the other.
Thank you. Councillor Elliott.
Thank you very much, Tom. Yours is a voice that's very appreciated in this room every time you work for us. I just have two questions of administration. I'm just going to leave the whole gateway thing out of this at the moment. I might come back with a question on that later. But on admin, our speaker today has referred to the disclosure statement, disclaimer statement. And I'm wondering if you could just chat a few moments and outline to what extent that disclaimer is standard text for the reports your company gives, and to what extent it is being customised for this.
It's standard text. And it's simply acknowledging the fact that when you're a consultant, You come into a situation and there is an information asymmetry that exists. People within the organisation understand this context and the situation much more than you do. So you come in and you're gathering information and you're triaging and triangulating and doing all sorts of things, and you won't necessarily always get it right in terms of the facts. The conclusions I draw, or we draw, we stand by. But, you know, if there's additional facts that come up, then that's another piece of information that we add into the thinking. That's a standard disclaimer.
Okay, thank you very much for confirming that. My other question may be for staff. Early September, the Mayor gave the okay and agreed to a request for a update report on the Gateway project. So that was given to us in a briefing last week, earlier this week, alongside Tom's briefing with us on this report. So I just wondered, I realised from that briefing we were told that there were some issues around timing of the release of that report, just to do with contracts and commercial sensitivities in it. But I'm wondering if we could have some idea of whether or not the update will be made public at some point, or publicly available to those that ask.
Chief Executive.
Councillor, at the meeting you were advised that there was a series of parties to be spoken to in order, and that once that was done, then obviously the public would be made aware. So those parties included iwi and various other stakeholders. So that is in train. I don't have the exact dates of when things will happen, but they are happening.
Okay, thank you very much for that. You know, I do note that report was a good news story. Yeah, really gave us personally full confidence in the project.
Councillor Coates.
Kia ora, Tom. Good to see you again. And I appreciate that some of us councillors have asked these questions through the briefings, and as you would have heard me say earlier, to the person in public speaking interrogated the consultants to a degree, so forgive me for asking similar questions or the same. When the Chief Executive announced the review of the process of Te Urahi, immediately there was criticism around the independence of Martin Jenkins, one because of the independent review that they had done on the organisation 2 years previous. And even on that review there was criticism because Martin Jenkins had previously done work around an economic impact assessment, which I was aware of at the time. So could you maybe just explain to us, and for the benefit of the public, what does that mean to Martin Jenkins as a company when they are approached by Kāpiti Coast District Council, Waka Kotahi, or any other organisation to conduct a review, and what you do and don't put in that review? And then I've got 3 further questions from there.
Thank you, Councillor. Martin Jenkins prides itself on its professionalism and the production of independent advice that has integrity and which tells our clients what they need to hear rather than what they want to hear. Sometimes if there's a coalescence of those two, there's a happy marriage. But I think in both the reports here, there were criticisms made, and that demonstrates the independence of the review. The fact that we've recognised that there are certain things that were going right doesn't invalidate the independence. That's, again, part of the integrity. There's always 2 sides to a story. And I personally stand by the independence and integrity that I bring to all of my work and over more than 30 years as a consultant.
Thank you, Tom. So the next part is, and I appreciate Councillor McCann asked you this in the briefing, were there any changes requested of you of the document from the management?
No, other than the fact-checking, which is what is a normal part of drafting any review, so that any further information that comes to light, and there was information that came to light on the communications planning side of things and information on the timeline, which was really, really helpful in enabling the final report to be put together.
Thanks, Tom. The report speaks a lot about the misinformation that was out there. How big a role do you think that played in terms of the view of the public of Te Urahi as a project?
I think that it played quite a significant role, and even today, there would be some people out there who are still wondering what is the project, even though a decision's been made, because they don't necessarily go to the place where all that's explained. And so they're listening to, and we all know, don't we, from the vaccination situation, the COVID situation, the role that misinformation can play, and how that can, different people use different sources of truth. And for them at the time, it's the truth,
Yeah, sure.
So,
my last question, you'll note from the organisational review that you did previously, part of the review was to actually look at elected members and their role, their behaviour, their way that they conduct themselves. I'm not asking you to clearly to name anybody, but what role did elected members play in terms of the communications around Te Urihi and whether it was positive or negative, or whether there was a mix of both? What responsibility do you feel we have, or changes that we need to look at making as elected members?
well, I think, as a governance group, you need to be looking at the strategic side of things and the way ahead. You also are, though, concerned about reputation, and you're concerned about the way things look. So you need to have a certain understanding. And there is an opportunity for you, and I said this in an independent report, to be supporting the decisions that are made by council out there. So if the council makes a decision, then it's more helpful to be supporting that than out there undermining it. Not suggesting any of that happened in this particular case. And I think that, in fact, councillors themselves were concerned about the degree of communication, which is why the councillor working group was requested to be formed. And there were, it was just 2020 was an annus horribilis as far as this review is concerned, even though a result was achieved.
Thank you. And my last, I said that was the last one. I do have one further one for the Chief Executive. I know it's mentioned in the report, but I think it needs to be mentioned. Could you explain the piece in the report where it refers to Kāpiti being eligible for the PGF funding and what that meant as an organisation and as a district?
Thanks, Councillor. So about a year into the PGF process, we were finally formally advised that we were eligible. And that put us on the back foot in all respects in terms of any applications to the PGF. As it happened, early in the piece, organisations were allowed to apply, for example, for funding to pursue the business cases and feasibility studies around the projects they wanted to put forward. By the time we were in, that money was no longer available. And obviously, by then, we took advice from the PGF representatives as to an appropriate approach. Because they were used to working with regions, they strongly recommended working groups be set up with the community to try and agree priorities for projects across our region. In our case, we were one district only, but we followed the same process. So we actually spent most of, I think, late 2018 to 2019 trying to get some sense of clear prioritisation out of our community about which projects they would like. So what it really meant is we started a year late, and all of our work through to putting in this one application was under time pressures as a result. And of course, you've already heard from Mr. Gott about the compounding impact of COVID at that time. I will add that the work that we undertook with the community was with the previous council, the earlier triennium. And I want to take this opportunity to note that the main sources of unrest amongst elected members was those who were new to it and had not participated through that process and had no context by which to understand the state of the Gateway project.
You done? Councillor Holbrook.
Thank you. Thank you for this report, and thank you for all the work that you've done for us. There's been so much learning that's come out of it, and I can already see learning that's coming out of this report and some of the other projects that we're pursuing at the moment, so really great to see. I wanted to just follow that up actually and talk about that application and the kind of achievement that was. I think there's a bit of a misconception about the amount of work that it takes to secure that funding from government. And this might be a question for the Chief Executive, maybe comment on the workload that the staff had to do in terms of that, and how the time pressures of that might have impacted on that late communication around the time of the application being made.
I'll say two things. At the beginning of both as management and councillors, because I do remember putting this to council, it was essentially a line call as to whether to proceed or not proceed, because we had 4 or 5 months to prepare an application through to an appropriate state to be accepted by the PGF. And it was a line call because that is, as Mr. Gott has referred to, very fast for a normal project like this. Whilst the project itself is not highly material, at a total of about $4.5 million, that's not a big project. The interest in it, and as played out, the opposition to it from a number of members of the community made it even more complicated to advance. And so because we were working through COVID, we also did not have the full set of resourcing that we would for a project even of this size, and it was left to a smaller number of people to undertake a lot of work around all the elements of the project, the design, the consenting, etc., the financials. So yep, it was a compressed time frame with a less than normal sized group because a large number of people were working on COVID. And at the beginning and at a couple of times through that process, we had to consciously go make a call as to whether to continue or not. As you know, we made those calls to continue based on the progress we saw to date. But your last question about how that affected communications, our entire comms team was involved in the EOC effectively through that period. And this is one of those points that Mr. Gott's referred to where he might say something that I might disagree with. He certainly did there, and it's his right to do so, and wasn't unexpected, that he felt our leadership and communication could have been better. I felt that I made the call, and I would make it again, that there was little point engaging with those 4 disaffected parties and wasting all of our time and energy on rebutting every single ridiculous argument that they raised. That was my call, and that is the point that Mr. Gott has said we could have done better, and I accept his input, as I should. It's not to say I would do a different thing in the future.
Actually, that segues nice into my next question, which is around our engagement in social media. So we've got a comment in the report that says that it can be an unsafe place for staff on community social media pages, and I fully endorse that comment. And I think it's not just a problem here, but throughout local government. Though, as elected members, though, we do, well, I personally, and during, potentially in those times when there wasn't that steady beat of information, I'm looking at the timeline, for instance, 2nd of June to 23rd of June, when a comms plan had been prepared, but there was a delay for various reasons in rolling that out. And during that time, I was one of the elected members who was on social media trying to correct misinformation in a reactive kind of way. And during the briefing, we heard that that's a lot less helpful than a steady beat of information. But in the absence of a steady beat, do you have any advice for elected members about that, an approach to correcting misinformation on social media?
I think picking up on Councillor McCann's point earlier, I think it's useful for a kōrero around communication to take place. And I think I wasn't suggesting in the review that, as I said, entering into a polemic with individuals on social media, but recognising that social media and community social media platforms exist. So therefore, how can one think about ensuring that there are links in there, or there are ways of ensuring that the council's voice can be heard. And I've talked about a steady beat of kind of neutral information. That's a high-level recommendation. I haven't had time to go in the nitty-gritty, but it's worth thinking about that rather than saying we're not going to engage. I think there's some real value. The world has changed. The way we talk to each other, the way we communicate, the way we interact is different from the way it used to be. And it's going to get even more different going forward.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Point of clarification.
Councillor Coates.
Just waiting for the microphone.
Sorry.
Apologies, Councillor Pravanov and Councillor Halliday. Your Worship, I'm asking the question because I'm unsure myself, and I just want to make sure that my colleagues don't compromise themselves or the council. Councillor Randall and Councillor Compton declared a conflict of interest. It's not certain why, and my understanding is they're not required to state why. They're just simply required to state a conflict. Councillor Halliday and Councillor Pravanov are both asking questions, and I just want to check with the Chief Executive whether understanding orders they can, given the notice motions and so forth. So possibly they can, and I certainly nothing personal in terms of those two members. If they can, I welcome that discussion, but I just wanted to check.
I was actually going to take a break before I approach the matter with them. That's right. So can we take a break now? 5-minute break.
Jet setter.
Martin.